Good evening, one and all. It's good to have you here tonight. I want to welcome those who are here and those who are watching via live stream and those who will watch the archives of this 2014 Cole Lectureship. This lectureship was established in 1893 by Colonel E.W. Cole of Nashville to bring distinguished lecturers to the campus in, and these are his words, in defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. Among the distinguished church leaders and theologians who have delivered the Cole lectures over the last 121 years are Harry Emerson Fosdick, Paul Tillich, H. Richard Niebuhr, Martin Marty, Krister Stendahl, Yaroslav Pelikan, James Gustafson, Raymond Brown, Fred Craddock, Paul Ricoeur, Walter Brueggemann, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Albert Rabateau, Margaret Miles, Gustavo Gutierrez, Wendy Donaker, Enrique Dussel, E. Brooks Holyfield, Rebecca S. Chop, James Cone, Donald Weiswinger, who is here tonight, Edward Farley, whom I don't think is here tonight, James Barr, David Buttrick, Marcus Borg, Parker Palmer, Jürgen Moltmann, Catherine Tanner, Peter Gomes, James Wallace, Mark Knoll, Randall Balmer, James Lawson, John W. O'Malley, S.J., and Elaine Pagels. This year's co-lecturer, Tex Sample, is a specialist in church and society, a United Methodist minister, a storyteller, author, and the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Professor Emeritus of Church and Society at St. Paul's School of Theology, a United Methodist Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri, where he taught from 1967 to 1999. One of his specialties is working class folk, and he has published several books in this field. They include Blue Collar Ministry, Facing Economic and Social Realities of Working People, Hard Living People and Mainstream Christians, Ministry in an Oral Culture, Living with Will Rogers, Uncle Remus, and Minnie Pearl, White Soul, Country Music and the Church and Working Americans, and Blue Collar Resistance and the Politics of Jesus. He has co-edited The Loyal Opposition, Struggling with the Church on Homosexuality, and has turned his attention to the power of spirituality and worship with his books, The Spectacle of Worship in a Wired World, Electronic Culture and the Gathered People of God, Powerful Persuasion, Multimedia Witness in Christian Worship, and Earthy Mysticism, Spirituality for Unspiritual People. Born in Brookhaven, Mississippi, Sample received a BA from Millsaps College, an MDiv and PhD from Boston University, and a DD from Coe College. A former cab driver, laborer, and oil field roustabout, he is currently a freelance speaker and consultant, a much sought-after lecturer, storyteller, workshop leader, and consultant. Tex is a contributor to many of the DVD programs in the Living the Question series and is currently serving as the interim minister of Trinity United Methodist Church in Kansas City, Missouri, an inclusive congregation that welcomes gays and lesbians. Dr. Sample, Tex, we welcome you to Vanderbilt and to the Divinity School. We look forward to your co-lectures this evening, and I remain eternally grateful that you taught me to check my hand position when I start slicing my drives off the tee, and that students will remember a good story and be able to work with it much longer than dense abstract discourse. Samples themes this year for the Coles Lectures is Talking the Talk, Walking the Walk, Fluency and Other Ministerial Practices in Ministry. Tonight, his focus is Talking the Talk, the Skills of Fluency in Ministry. Immediately after tonight's lecture, we invite you and the audience to a reception in the reading room, which is also the former refectory. And before I ask us all to welcome you with a warm response, I'd like to present to you something. Now, what you need to know about this part is that Tex's wife, Peggy Jo Sample, one of the most wonderful women in the world, because look who she's married to, is an artist, and this is some of her work. And now, would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tex Sample.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that, dear. So much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Let's see, there we go. Thank you so very much. I am delighted to be here. I'm also honored and privileged to be here. So I want to greet the faculty, the staff, the students, other guests, university people for this very kind invitation. I've already received quite generous hospitality, and I appreciate that very much. So let me with that go to work. I was 14 years old, and I was going out for the high school football team. We were basically cannon fodder for the B team. All right. I noticed that every time I ran into, I did not say tackled, every time I ran into one of those B team boys, I had these terrible pains down my back. And since I didn't do anything about it, they got worse. One day I was out playing with a friend and made the wrong move and could barely walk, went into the house, got in the bathroom, got on the floor, and could not get up. I laid there, as I recall, 2 or 3 hours waiting for my mother to come home. When she got home, she managed to get me off the floor and into a bed and decided we better go see the bone doctor. That was our language. And we went. While I was lying on that bathroom floor, though, the words going through my mind were incurable disease, paralysis, death. And all that seemed to do was to make that back hurt all the more. So we went to the bone doctor. The bone doctor examined me and said, "You have spondylolisthesis," which took me 10 years, as I recall, to pronounce. He said, "You've got a vertebrae that sits forward about 1/4 of an inch in your back. I'm going to put a brace on you now, and then you'll come back this summer and we'll have surgery." I said, "Well, will I be able to play football after surgery?" He said, "No, you'll be a semi-invalid the rest of your life." Now, let me be fair to him. He knew a rambunctious teenager when he saw one. And maybe he was trying to scare the hell out of me, all right? At least he succeeded. But notice now the language that I had. The language was spondylolisthesis, which I couldn't pronounce. He told me I might step off a curb and be paralyzed. He told me I needed back brace and surgery, and I'd be a semi-invalid. Well, I never went back for the surgery. I fell into the hands of a chiropractor, for which I've always been grateful, who used different language. He used the language of adjustment. You've got an unstable back. You pinch nerves, especially your sciatic nerve. And with regular visits, we can keep you functional. And yes, I would not recommend football, but you can play baseball. That was the beginning of my lifelong love affair with that game. I am not a fan. I am a fanatic. Strange thing happened, though, across the years. Across the years, I learned that stretching was very important. Exercise, very important. A reasonably flat stomach, very important. So notice how my language has changed. It's gone now to exercise, to stretching, to flat belly, and then the big word, manage your back. I can now have a spasm as severe as the one I had when I was a kid. But even if I have a spasm that severe, the pain has changed because I bring different vocabulary, I bring different words, I bring different concepts. Now, to be sure, those are all intermixed with practices of another kind, but we'll talk about that tomorrow, all right? I'm trying to suggest that language shapes our experience in powerful, powerful ways. James Edwards is one of my favorite philosophers, not because I agree with him, but because he makes me think in ways I don't normally think. He says this: language is not a medium for our lives and practices. Rather, it's the stuff of human life itself. It's the thread out of which all our patterns of thought and action are woven. So think of language with me, if you will, for a while, as really of the stuff of human life. And it is so mixed in with everything. Can I put it this way? Have you ever noticed that you cannot transcend language to talk about language? You just cannot do it. And I have come to believe that there's a way that you can change someone's language and change their experience. That happened to me. That there is a relationship between the stuff of language and the character of experience. I guess I'm saying in a way that experience is vocabulary dependent. All right? There's a guy named Kenneth Bailey wrote a book called Poet and Peasant. And in that book, he spent years in the Middle East. He says that people in the Middle East do not have a concept for sarcasm, that the word does not occur in their language. It is a non-Middle Eastern form of speech, he says. That there is no equivalent of our word sarcasm in Arabic. He reports that he has spent hours with people in the Middle East trying to convey what sarcasm is, difficult as that may be. So here the role that language and vocabulary have. I want to say it's concept-dependent experience, that is. And I love what Talal Assad, who's, to my mind, one of the best anthropologists we have, he says that we operate in a field of categories in our lives. Ian Hacking is a philosopher, and an awfully good one, I think. He argues this, that the notion that classifications, vocabulary, and questions, those categories, he says when those are asked by therapists, he said there is good evidence to suggest that those help to develop multiple personalities back in the latter part of the 20th century. He says, he discusses the way in which publicly identifying and describing a condition creates the means by which that condition spreads. Here's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to suggest something of the power of words and language, concepts, vocabulary. He tells a story about New Zealand. There was a group that was about to publish a piece which described and depicted certain pornographic acts that no one had ever thought of, they contended. And the New Zealand authorities squelched that report. They did not want to conceptualize, speak such acts, because they believed they would spread those acts across the population. Hear the point? Now, I'll leave you to struggle with the question of free speech. That's something I tend to believe in. But I would like for you to hear the point that they're making, that when you come up with new kinds of categories, concepts, words, and in that case, of course, practices, you are opening up the world to new things. I guess I'm trying to suggest that as people in ministry consider language, fluency takes on an importance that is magnified when one begins to think in these terms. Now, tonight, I'm not going to spend much time talking about preaching. I think it's very important. Right now, I'm doing it every Sunday to the same group of people. Oh, my goodness, how scary that is, all right? But I want to talk about fluency across a whole range of practices of ministry. And that's not only something that the clergy do, that's something that the laity do, all right? So fluency, I think, appreciates the power of language, the character of it, and how it so shapes our experience. Now, when you talk that way, obviously, fluency is quite complex, very complex. I think sometimes we don't appreciate how sophisticated the fluency of anyone who can really speak and operate with language in a given form of life. Harry Matthews is an American who lived in France for some 40 years. He had spoken at a meeting once, and someone in the audience said, "You know, you are fluent in French. You speak it so well. Why don't you write in French? You write always in English." He said, "Because I do not have the sensible infrastructure of high schools in France." He did not go to high school there. And I don't know, think back about your own high school experience and think about how you learned words and what they mean. Let me try just one quick little experience. I'm the class of 53, and we had both a saying and a song. I'm going to tell you what it is, okay? The saying was, "We like coffee, we like tea, we're the class of 53. Now, if I were you, I would think that was silly and rather shallow. But that's because you don't have the sensible infrastructure that goes with it. You understand? Also, Hank Williams died in January 1, actually, of 1953, just 5 months before we graduated. Our class song was "Your Cheatin' Heart." Now, you may say that has absolutely nothing to do with graduating from high school in 53, except maybe the timing. I want to say to you, that's because you don't have the sensible infrastructure of being at that high school in those years. You understand what I'm trying to get? Let me put it another way. Harold Beck, who was professor of Old Testament at Boston University while I was there and was just simply wonderful. Harold Beck was a big man, 300 plus pounds, and when he would talk about the prophets, Harold had this jowl that when he would shake his head, that jowl would just go back and forth, you know, like the ringers on a big bell. I mean, you just knew that he was something like what Isaiah, as Isaiah appeared, you know. But Harold Beck told a story about Mark Twain. Mark Twain was shaving one morning, cut himself, and then cursed a blue streak. His spouse had grown, I guess, tired of that. So she walked over to him and repeated every word he said. Beck says, Twain was enough of a 19th century chauvinist to be taken aback. But he suddenly smiled and said, my dear, you've got all the words right, but you don't know the tune. I remember in the oil field, well, I was a college boy. That's how I worked 5 summers in the oil field. And what I remember was that some of us guys who would come in out of the colleges, we'd hear the roustabouts cuss. And I want to tell you, there were some of those men for whom cussing, and not cursing, cussing. We didn't curse, we cussed. Cussing was an art form. And you know, when you come out of college and you're working out there the first month or so, you want to cuss. And it was funny. When we would cuss, they would laugh. They would just laugh. We didn't know the tune. Let's take it to the South for a moment. Well, that was South, actually. But my sister has an expression I love. I wish I could understand it. I think I said for a piece for you folks, I said, you know, when I was starting out, I wanted to understand mystery. And the longer I've lived, you know what I really want to understand? I want to understand the ordinary. And I'm convinced now I never will. I never will. But my sister is fluent. Oh, my. You should hear her say, bless your heart. You Southerners know. You can say bless your heart, and it means how many things? A dozen? Oh, more than that. 2 dozen things? She can really mean bless your heart, may God bless you. And she may also mean go to hell. And worse. So the fluency, but also the complexity of language and its use are just extremely important. Any of you who've ever gone off to school, as I did, my daddy went to the 5th grade, my mother went to the 10th. So going off to college was strange territory. And then I began to talk differently. We called it talk, not speak. I remember I took a course with Paul Tillich. It just intimidates me to death that he was once the co-lecturer, but nevertheless. But Paul Tillich, I took a course from him at Harvard back in either the late 50s or the early 60s. And in class one day, he sat behind this 3 by 5 foot table, and he said, "Man is a history-making, historical being." Well, I go home and tell my dad that, you know. And my dad's response was, "Oh, bleep, son," you know. That just didn't have any carriage with my father. So the complexities of fluency. And when you move into a community of a different vocabulary, if you've been trained in the academy and you go to a working class white congregation, and unless you've got something you can fall back on, how do you learn to be fluent there? One of the problems that you have when you're inadequately educated is you think they've got the problem. And they need to learn to speak rather than we need to learn to be more fluent. That kind of thing. There are also, and I'm trying to suggest that now, I'm trying to suggest that there are vocabularies within different languages. I mean, there are vocabularies within the same language. William Greenway and Lee Weatherby did a piece for Theological Education back in 2009, and their contention there is that there are multiple vocabularies. And they say there is no objective or neutral vocabulary. That vocabulary, hear this line, I thought it was really on the money. Vocabularies powerfully speak themselves through us before we speak them. And then they say they never cease to profoundly influence and constrain how we feel and think. My only comment would be, I think the words profoundly influence and constrain are not adequate to the full expression of the role of language, of vocabulary. So learning to listen for different vocabularies, it seems to me, is just as basic to ministry as anything one can imagine. A while back, I played for 3 years on the Twin Cities softball team. It's an all-black team, except me. They couldn't find a black guy dumb enough to catch, and I couldn't run fast enough to play anywhere else, so I caught for them. One of the interesting things that hit me immediately is that when one of the guys would hit a ball or make a great catch, make a great pick, make a great throw, the guys who were watching would say this, "Hey, Joe, I see you, baby. I see you." And I was sitting there and I'm saying, "Well, yeah, we see him. What is that supposed to mean?" Now, I'd been around that stuff enough to know I needed to pay attention to it, and that went on all 3 seasons. And so I'm listening as carefully as I can and trying to get to know as much as I can, because part of the reason to play on the team was not only to play ball. I wanted to just, get in that kind of relationship with some guys. About 3 of the people on the team were professional, African-American folk, and the rest of them were largely working-class African-American folk. So it was really good in that sense. I came to this kind of conclusion. Black guys have been throwing balls, hitting balls, catching balls, picking balls for a long, long time. The question always was, did anybody see it? Did anybody see it? I told this to a friend of mine this week, a guy named Sam Mann, and Sam said, yeah, he said, I wonder too if what's also going on is they're saying, in spite of all, you're able to do this, and I see you. Interesting thing. James Alt has done a wonderful study of a Jerry Falwell congregation in Worcester, Massachusetts. The title of the book is Spirit and Faith, and I recommend that you read it if you've not had a chance to. Jim is an anthropologist and a good one, PhD out of Brandeis, and at the time he went in to do that study, I think he would call himself probably an agnostic leaning toward atheism. All right. He was there with that church 3 years, and he did not convert to Falwell's Baptist stance, but it led him back into the Episcopal Church. But one of the things he addresses there is the use of the word absolute in that congregation. He says that congregation was absolutely opposed to divorce. Now, in the literate world, absolute means absolute. If you're opposed to divorce, you make no exceptions, right? But in the oral culture of that congregation, they actually made exceptions. It's interesting, he talks about one woman who was married to a man who was continually spending money they needed for the family. One illustration was that he bought a $300 squirrel gun when they did not have the money for groceries. And that church took the position that she had to divorce him. And he argues that the way those folks understood that was, yes, we are absolutely opposed to divorce. But there are those occasions in which it may be necessary. He said that they could use that kind of an ethic in a supple way. He also maintains that the moral structure of their thinking was in a sense coterminous with, let me say it another way, that it was supportive of, that it sustained the family life. And that when an exception could be made to divorce, it was when that relationship had deteriorated to the point that position on absolutes was no longer sustaining the viability and the coping capacity of that family. You see how the word absolute gets used differently there? And it is so rich in country music. Oh my goodness. James Alt says that traditional moral structure is in basic part an attempt to control male sociality. That is, men will go out and go to the honky-tonks, traipse around, etc. And his argument is that morality, in part, is a way to try to control men and that sociality. Listen to the music. One of the classic songs that never goes out of style. Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys. Don't let them pick guitars and drive them old trucks, but make them be doctors and lawyers and such. And you say, well, wait a minute, doctors and lawyers, they can mess around, they can walk out the door, yeah, but you can sue them. You can sue hell out of them and get money for it. You understand? That's that difference. So the music says it, and in some powerful ways. So the vocabularies within a language and the capacity of ministry to cross some of those boundaries. Now, when you cross those boundaries, you can't just do that by walking into a community. What that means is there needs to be the kind of apprenticeship learning that goes on. It also means you need a mentor. And sometimes you can be in a church where you're fortunate enough where there might be a half a dozen people who do that kind of mentoring with you, because while they may not spell it out the way I spell it out, they get it better than I do by far. Do you understand what I'm trying to suggest? So that apprenticeship is so crucial. There's a guy named Paul Griffiths who talks about another dimension of this I'd like for you to consider. And that's what Griffiths calls deep grammar. Deep grammar. And what he means by deep grammar is the central semantic terms. The central semantic terms and their ordinary syntactical relations. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute. Hang on. What he's trying to look at are what are the kinds of terms that are embedded in a language, and then how are those used in relationship to other terms in that language, all right? Let me give you an example. Talal Asal, you'll find that I love his work. Talal Asal has a discussion of how the word religion was invented in the West. He said in the medieval period we didn't have the word religion, we had the word religious, which meant you were part of an order, in the church. He said, but when you begin to get the development of the discourse around the emergence of the nation state in the early modern period, he said religion becomes a concept that he says is invented. And he says, notice what happens with that concept of religion. Religion is, first of all, seen as individualistic. Secondly, it's a private matter. How many times have you heard people say religion is a private matter? It's in the ordinary language of our culture. They say that religion is peripheral. I'm trying to do organizing of voters in north of the river in Kansas City. One of the biggest problems we have in terms of getting churches to, we're not partisan, we're nonpartisan, we're just trying to organize voters and get them out to vote. One of our problems getting churches to participate is they simply say that's political and we ought not do that. Where does that come from? I would suggest it comes from this discourse, and it just permeates this culture. It's also seen as subjective. It's my inner stuff. And notice how the biblical notion of heart has been transposed in terms of heart in modern bourgeois culture. Radically different thing. It's also a matter of choice. Choice. I want to tell you, and my hunch is there are a lot of people in this room that would say something similar, perhaps. I did not choose to be a Christian. I got flat called. I did not choose to go into the ministry. My Lord, God just kept biting me on the backside till I did it. You call that choice? You understand the difference? Not choice. Beliefs. It's the reduction of a faith tradition to beliefs. So here it then again, individualistic, privatistic, peripheral, subjective, a matter of personal choice, and basically concerned with beliefs. What does that do to religion? I would contend that what it basically does is moves faith traditions to the periphery of society, so it stays out of the public square and it doesn't get engaged in issues of social justice and the rest. Watch how that concept functions to shape opinion and life in this culture. Could I try just a quick thing, and then we better move? Yeah. There's a lot of concern about, the decline of churches and membership. That started out with the decline of the mainline church. Now, of course, the conservative churches are in decline. So that's changed the whole tenor of that thing. May I suggest three things to you? Take a look at the way religion is conceived in the society. Now, you've got this other thing about religion and spirituality, and religion is tied to institutional, but institutional is still that kind of peripheral piece, okay, individualistic and the rest. Look at spirituality, though, and do some critique of that, all right? But when you think about religion in those terms as peripheral, then you place it in a culture that is as consumerist as ours. And the thing about consumerism is that it commodifies almost everything. And then you place that in a society for the last 40 years that has seen the decline of wages and the loss of income by literally millions of people in this society. Let me give you one quick figure. From the end of World War II to the mid-70s, productivity in this country increased 103% plus. But wages increased 103%, actually 0.2 of a more than productivity. Since the mid-70s, productivity has increased about 70%. For the bottom 40% of the jobs, those wages have not just stayed flat, they've declined. And you've got some others that are barely increasing above that amount. In other words, productivity is no longer related to what people earn. What does that mean? Now, I'm for women, obviously, I hope that's obvious, being in the workforce and all that. What happens now when you've got to have, if you've got two adults in a family, and if you do, that's fortunate. If you've got two adults making money, they both have to work, not just full-time. I know people who are working 2 jobs and some working 3 jobs, and there are 2 of them working just to try to make it because they're making $7.35 an hour. All right? So that kind of an issue, that kind of question. Now, put it this way. If you see religion as peripheral, if you see it as a commodity that you choose, if you're busting your tail and your spouse is busting his or hers, and you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, when do you have time? I don't hear anybody talking about those characteristics and why the decline of the church may be related to issues like that. I don't mean to let the church off the hook. We've got churches that need to do a lot themselves. But do you hear my point? So what am I trying to suggest? I'm trying to say that the role of deep grammar, and I'm using a negative illustration here, but the role of deep grammar in shaping our lives, that means in ministry, start listening to the key concepts people use and listen to how they're related to one another and figure out what's going on in that language and how people's experience is shaped by it. Am I communicating that kind of? All right, so what? What do we do with this? Let me try it, and I'm going to make it, I think. Let me try a number of suggestions in terms of ministry. One thing I think we need is that we need to offer vocabularies of faith and faithfulness that counter the ways in which religion is conceptualized in this culture. I think the introduction of more faithful categories can indeed play a role in changing the experience of people. We sometimes talk about changing their experience. I'm not against that. But I want to say what fluency requires is also changing vocabulary. Wade Clark Roof, in a study 21 years ago, said that baby boomers, his language was, do not have a clear and compelling vocabulary of faith. And what I want to say is that I think that has come generationally. It's working its way through the generations. I do a thing on 2 Thursday nights a month at the Uptown Arts Bar in Kansas City. It's called, I'm sorry, it doesn't sound very humble, but we call it Texas Wrestling. It's TEX''S wrestling. Got the picture? And it's no holds barred theological conversation. Now, anybody can come, and a lot of folk do, well, not a lot, but different folk come. One of the things that I'm struck by often is that unless somebody has a grounding in the church, it's the poverty of concepts of faith that I hear. And it's how much of that is oriented around consumer language. I want to meet my needs. My problem with that is, now if there are genuine needs, of course, but the way that's used so often is, I want what I want. I don't know about you, but I go to church not to get those kind of needs met, but to get my needs changed. Hear the difference? And we need a vocabulary of faith that begins to address those kinds of questions, those kinds of issues. Ann Taves did an unpublished paper, and she says this about what we need in terms of vocabularies of faith and faithfulness. She said we need, first of all, a vocabulary that recognizes that there are competing and conflicting and contradictory claims in any faith tradition, that we don't make it look like we got it all together. In fact, I'd say this: the problem with having it all together is it constitutes a totalism. And I don't know about you, I happen to believe that God reveals self in Jesus Christ. All right? I believe that. I believe that we see the character of God in Christ. Now, I'm not about to tell God, however, that God, you did not reveal yourself to any other faith tradition. I don't know about you, but that's above my pay grade. It's above my pay grade. So that sense of some kind of humility in one's claims, it seems to me, is utterly crucial. Also, to draw on the tradition, the rich tradition the coherence of it. I love Alistair McIntyre's comment that a tradition is an argument. And if you've read most anything in the tradition of the Christian faith and other traditions, you recognize that indeed it is argument. She says it needs to be a vocabulary that has an ecumenical sensibility. But she also says it needs an interfaith appreciation. She says it needs to stress institutional renewal and reform. And it needs, on the one hand, corporate belief and practice, and on the other hand, contemplative and meditative life of prayer. Now, that's not exhaustive, and certainly she would not make that claim, but it seems to me that's something of the direction we need in terms of a new vocabulary. I think in a sense we need to, I'm going to put it in quotes, we need to invent new language. Now, hardly anybody ever invents a word. What that usually means is you draw on a word out of the tradition, out of the past somewhere and use it. But do you know Katangoli's book, The Sacrifice of Africa? If you haven't read it tomorrow or tonight if you got it. He talks in there about a wonderful woman named Maggie. Maggie was caught in that Burundi civil war. And you remember that two of the major conflicting elements were the Tutsis on the one hand and the Hutus on the other. And what Maggie did was she adopted 7 Hutu and Tutsi children. She was caught in the very middle of that thing. On 2 occasions, she was captured and forced to watch the killing of the people of her villages. Somehow they did not kill her. As that war draws to a close, she begins to pull together this village, and she does these, oh my, she develops job training around hairdressing, for example, and auto mechanics. She builds a swimming pool, has a swimming pool built over the tunnels where people were buried who had been slaughtered in that war. She said, I want our children to have a joy-filled imagination. She even built a theater, a movie theater, and with real theater seats. A man came to kill her. He'd been sent by one of the armies to come in and kill Maggie. And she said to him, well, there's nothing I can do about that. If you decide to kill me, you can sure do it. But I wonder, would you be interested in seeing a movie before you do? They thought about it. They figured, yeah, I think we might. They see the movie and decide, well, maybe we won't burn the theater down and we'll let you continue. And they do. That's fluency. That's fluency. There's another piece there in terms of the invention of new language. The word that one might have used for this community, this village that she's building, was amahora in that language. It's the Kirundi word for peace. The problem was the children in that village had heard that word used when some of the armies were killing their parents and some of their brothers and sisters. You know how people kill for peace? So Magi came up with Maison Shalom. Yes, it's French. But she invented that concept because that notion of peace was not associated with the violence and the devastation and the slaughter. And she decided that, and I don't mean she decided, this is stuff she did with that community, of course. But they decided to be a new tribe that was beyond the Hutsi, the Tutsi, and the Twa. And the children were asked whether they were Hootsie or Tootsie? And they said this. They said, we are Hootsie Twa Congo Zungu. That's one word. Hear it again. We are Hootsie Twa Congo Zungu. One word. She's inventing new language by combining words. I think we need to undermine a dominant fluency. Let me use a kind of a simple illustration here. Watch out for the imperialism of categories and the way in which categories can control us. I think in a consumer's world, the word experience, notice how that word is so often used. People collect experiences or even buy experiences the way one would consume items. Experience becomes something you get. Peggy and I spent 13 years in Arizona, 2 years before now, and I had the opportunity to be with some Native American folk. And I was in conversations at times when they would talk about how Anglos would come into Arizona. Sometimes they were Arizona Anglos. And they would want to have Native American experiences, you know, like go to a sweat lodge. Now, I don't mean to demean all forms of that. There are forms of that that I think are appropriate. But you should hear the way these folk laugh at Anglos who come in to, and I'm going to use this advisedly, to buy an experience. Let me urge you to start talking about experience in a different way. Think about experience the way you would talk about it in a trade. All right? I'm talking about where you apprenticed and you became a journey person. Huh? I mean, for example, when my plumber comes to my house, it just absolutely disgusts me. All right? He looks at what's going on. He asks me a couple of questions. And then he fixes it. And he stays clean. Do you understand why I'm just disgusted with him? See? My point is, notice the difference between experience, the experience of someone in a trade, and collecting experiences in a consumerist world. So undermine that dominant fluency by talking about things like experience in another way. Also, to take people out of categories. Wendell Berry did a very nice piece on this in the Christian Century back in April of last year. He says one of the things about Jesus was that Jesus took people out of categories. And he speaks explicitly to Jesus and the woman caught in adultery and how he took her out of that category and put her in another one. And I might say took a murderous mob out of a category of righteousness and put it in a radically different category. Or there's a wonderful young woman, to me that's anybody under 40, there's a wonderful young woman in Kansas City named Melissa Robinson, and she heads up the Black Healthcare Coalition. She spoke to a group I meet with called the Urban Summit every week, and she was talking about her work in healthcare and particularly mental health, but not only that. She said, one of the things that we have learned is that we no longer ask people what's wrong with you. No, indeed, don't ever ask that, she said. Instead, ask, what happened to you? Hear how that changes the conversation and changes the categories and opens up all kinds of possibilities. That's her testimony. I don't have her experience in this, but not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So fluency is that kind of turn, that kind of capacity to use the language and to change the experience of a people. I love a guy named Bill Cotton's been an experienced pastor, so highly competent, so able in so many ways as a clergy person. He says this, he says, what we've got to do is to people the minds
of the church, to people the minds of the church. For example, on the whole LGBTQ issue, how do you people the minds of the church so that they don't see abstractions and they don't see all the kind of conceptual imposition that's been placed on folk who've had to deal with utterly tragic circumstances? So that way of people the minds of the church. Can I go 5 more minutes? Is that okay? My mother-in-law and my mother were visiting us. I had been asked by the Board of Church Society of the Kansas East Conference to take them on a trip through Kansas City, kind of getting to know some of the organizations in the LGBTQ community. All right, now, this has been a few years back. But Mama arrived, and my mother-in-law arrived, and Mama said, I said, Mama, now I got to run out tonight for a few hours, but I'll be back, and that's the only time I'll be away. She says, well, that's fine. What are you doing? Well, I've just agreed to meet some folks and take them around the community. To do what? Well, Mama, I'm just going to take them around and meet some people and get to know some folks. Who? I mean, as an adolescent, you didn't stand a chance, okay? I said, well, Mama, we're going to go around and meet some folks in the gay and lesbian community. You are not. Mama, I promised them I would go, and so I am going to have to go. No, you can't do that. Well, Mama, now, Mama, I am 50 years old. You ain't going to do that. Well, Mama, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I am going to have to go. Can I go too? Yeah. Will you tell your daddy? No. And my mother-in-law says, well, if she's going, I'm going. And I said, well, that's fine. So we go, I know this sounds like a story, but it's the truth. The guy who's going to take us, you know, we went to a couple of bars. We went to a group called the Phoenix Society and so forth. This is back in the early 70s, so it's kind of, I guess I wasn't 50, whatever I was 35 or 40. So we go, but the guy who's leading us, so help me, he looks like Robert Redford. I'm sorry, but it's true, he does. He was one good-looking guy. So we go, and we go all around town and get in some bars and some other things. And I can tell Mama, and we call my mother-in-law Gal Peggy. I loved my mother-in-law. She didn't like me so much. Well, if you'd taken Peggy Sample off to Boston and then to Kansas City, you can understand that, you know. But anyhow, they were having a good time. And Mama comes over to me and gives me the elbow, you know, and she says, son, that beautiful boy, you know, she's an old woman, that beautiful boy, is he, is he? Yeah, Mama, he is. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. We come to the end of the evening. We're in the Rail Rider, which was a lesbian bar, and we're going outside to leave. And when we get outside, the young man says, I wonder if you would be willing to go over to the middle section of the boulevard over there and let me just say a final word to you. We'd be glad to. So we all go and gather around him. And he said, I want you to know that this is the first time I have ever been with a group of people in the church who knew who I was and accepted me the way you have. And I wonder if you would be all right with my praying with us. Well, of course. He bowed his head, and it was a prayer that was so simple in its way that it was embarrassing. Because what he said was, I want to thank you, God, for this opportunity to be with people who are in the church, who know me, and have been kind to me. Mama, that is just so beautiful. My mama had different faces, but she also had different language. She heard words she had never heard. She heard concepts she had never heard. She heard vocabulary that night she had never heard. Did my mother change overnight? No, but she began change. I think that's what fluency is.
Well, I can't say what I'm thinking because I'm the dean, but gosh darn you, Tex. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I invite you all now to get a bit of food and drink. A meal of sorts is next door. And also to join us again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Here again in Benton Chapel. Thank you again, Dr. Sample.